In the mist-shrouded depths of 17th-century woodlands, when the boundary between the sacred and the profane was marked in blood, a name arose that would echo through the centuries as a cursed whisper: Jean Grenier. No, he was neither a creation of Hollywood nor a myth spun from modern folklore. Jean existed. He was tried. And he confessed to atrocities so grotesque that even the inquisitors trembled as they recorded them. He claimed to be a werewolf, not by inheritance but by pact. A frail, malnourished boy forgotten by all, who said he ran through the fields on hairy paws, jaws dripping with blood. What if lycanthropy were more than mere superstition? What if it were the expression of a mind shattered by trauma and neglect? In revisiting the case of the werewolf of La Roche-Chalais, we unearth not only a bizarre trial, but a dark mirror reflecting the childhood terrors that still haunt us. Prepare yourself to explore a tale where the lines between monster and victim, madness and curse, reality and myth dissolve in a thick fog of ancient horrors. This is the story that inspired werewolf films, but it was infinitely worse than any fiction. In the spring of 1603, amid the sweltering stillness of La Roche-Chalais, a small, isolated village in southwest France, the woods seemed to hide something more sinister than mere wolves among their gnarled trees. It was against this backdrop that chilling reports began to emerge. Children vanished without a trace, and the few bodies discovered were brutally torn apart, flesh ripped away, bones shattered as if something or someone had feasted with savage abandon. The villagers, long accustomed to local superstitions and legends, began whispering of werewolves. Amid the shadows of this mounting fear rose one ominous name: Jean Grenier. He was no man. He was a boy, an adolescent of 13, gaunt, unkempt, with hollow eyes like bottomless wells, with no friends, no formal education, and every tenderness denied. Jean lived on society's margins, the son of a destitute peasant who, it was rumored, beat and neglected him often. His presence was almost spectral, as though the world itself had cast him out. Yet it was what he spoke with a crooked smile that chilled the blood of the entire village. He claimed to hunt by night as a wolf, claws and fangs at the ready, guided by a hooded master who had granted him a magical wolf's pelt in exchange for his loyalty. Jean Grenier was arrested after confessing to several peasants that he was responsible for the attacks, recounting in unsettling detail how he killed the children and devoured their entrails by moonlight. He showed no agitation, no remorse. On the contrary, he spoke with a cold enthusiasm, as though relaying a heroic feat. During interrogation, he described satanic rituals and nocturnal gatherings with others like him, a lupine brotherhood of human bodies and bestial souls. He claimed a man in a black cloak had given him a magic ointment which, when rubbed on his skin, transformed him into a wolf and freed him to run, kill, and eat. The court that tried him was no ordinary tribunal, but a hybrid ecclesiastical civil body charged with witchcraft and heresy cases. By then, the Catholic Church was beginning to abandon a literal belief in lycanthropy, viewing such instances more as signs of insanity or possession. Still, the weight of that boy's words unsettled the judges. He described the mutilations with such precision. The places where the bodies lay, the victims' garments identified by sight. Yet it was not the coherence of his tales that horrified them most. It was his conviction. Jean genuinely believed he turned into a wolf. To modern eyes, it might be easy to diagnose Jean with a severe form of childhood psychosis, perhaps schizophrenia, exacerbated by years of abuse, isolation, and neglect. But in the 17th century, understanding of the human mind was rudimentary and steeped in theology. Lycanthropy was, to many, a physical heresy, a breach of God's natural order. And Jean Grenier, with his feral aspect and unblinking gaze, fit the image of the damned sinner, corrupted from birth. Throughout his trial, Jean denied nothing. On the contrary, he seemed proud. He proclaimed his lupine form truer than his human one, that his instincts were more real than any church teaching. "The wolf is myself," he declared in a passage recorded by the inquisitors, "and when I run among the trunks, scenting fear, I am freer than I have ever been in life." His words stirred both horror and an odd pity. There was something tragic about this creature who, at 13, knew only violence as a means to exist. The court chose not to sentence him to death, as was common for witchcraft or lycanthropy verdicts. Instead, Jean was sent to a convent in Bordeaux under the supervision of monks tasked with tending to his soul and sanity. Yet the monks' reports did little to reassure. They wrote that Jean spoke to shadows, howled at night, and once tried to bite a novice's hand. Others said he ate raw meat and refused to pray. For 7 years he remained cloistered, growing ever more withdrawn, silent and hollow. He died at 20, forgotten, an afterthought in the annals of medieval madness. But Jean Grenier's story did not perish with him. It echoed through the centuries, studied, debated, and reinterpreted by historians, psychologists, and writers alike. It spawned tales, plays, and later werewolf films capturing the beast that resides within man. Yet few recall, or choose to recall, that Jean was not a mythic monster but a broken boy, shaped by misery and abandonment, who found in the wolf his only means to be feared, to be heard, and perhaps to be loved. Thus the tale of the werewolf of La Roche-Chalais transcends mere horror. It is a cruel parable of how society can forge its own monsters, not through curses or sorcery, but through indifference, violence, and silence. And the howl that once rang through those forests may still reverberate down the dark alleyways of our modern cities, where wounded children wait to be heard before they too become blood-soaked legends. In the convent of Bordeaux, where Jean spent his final years, damp walls and incense could not erase the traces of what many believed to be a corrupted soul. The monks, accustomed to penitents and sinners, had never faced anything like him. There was in Jean an aggressive silence, a gaze that sought no mercy but watched like a predator awaiting its prey's momentary lapse. It was as though his trial utterances lingered in the air, filling the corridors with a dread no crucifix could dispel. Though centuries strove to bury the case beneath layers of rationality and psychology, Jean's story never vanished entirely. It continued to be whispered, adapted, romanticized, until it became archetype. The werewolf we know today, with its fangs and lunar curse, owes part of its genesis to that frail French boy. Yet beneath those claws and transformations lies a truth rarely explored on screen. The monster was not born of another's bite, but of absence. Absence of love, of care, of comprehension. In 17th century France, children like Jean were commonplace. Child abandonment was an invisible plague. Famine, domestic violence, illiteracy, and exploitation were the fertile ground for future criminals, or, in the era's view, damned souls. Childhood was not regarded as a time of innocence but of danger, and when a child transgressed, it was simpler to brand them an agent of evil than to see them as its victim. Jean Grenier never had a childhood. Evidence suggests he was beaten, neglected, left to fend for himself in an unforgiving world. His retreat into the fantasy of lycanthropy may have been a bid to reclaim power. Imagining himself a wolf, strong, swift, feared, Jean did more than escape his misery. He seized control over it. Modern psychologists might describe this as severe dissociation, fueled by delusions and hallucinations. But in that time, such visions were not analyzed, they were punished or exorcised. Interestingly, Jean's case coincided with a historical shift. lycanthropy ceased to be viewed solely as a curse and began to be seen as a mental disorder. In the Middle Ages, werewolves were hunted and executed like witches, yet during the Renaissance and early modern age, some scholars, even devout ones, recognized in these accounts signs of soul and mind maladies. Jean Grenier, given his age and behavior, became one of the earliest cases where lycanthropy was treated as symptom rather than essence, and it is here that his story connects powerfully with contemporary issues. Today, mental illness still carries stigma. Children displaying aggressive, self-destructive, or antisocial behaviors are often ostracized, labeled, punished, rather than understood. Jean's past may seem distant, but it recurs in every neglected child, every teenager abandoned in violent, scarred communities. The true horror of Jean's tale lies not in his belief that he was a werewolf, but in the fact that no one offered him a better story to believe in. And, as with every enduring myth, Jean Grenier's legend gained new layers over time. In the 19th century, French writers revisited his case with renewed fascination. Some romanticized him as a symbol of the struggle between nature and civilization. Others saw him as proof of latent childhood perversity. With the advent of horror cinema in the 20th century, the werewolf figure solidified as a mirror of human dualities, civilization and savagery, reason and instinct, humanity and bestiality. Yet Jean's forgotten face, with its empty eyes and crooked smile, remained largely absent. Still, there is something profoundly current in the fear Jean inspires, because it compels us to ask, what becomes of those society fails most grievously, when pain finds no solace and madness blooms in fertile neglect? Jean Grenier stands as a specter of what we choose to ignore. He embodies the peril of demonizing the misunderstood and the ease with which suffering becomes spectacle. How many similar stories are retold today under different names and settings, yet end the same? His case also illuminates how we build myths from tragedy. By casting Jean as the werewolf of La Roche-Chalais, society domesticated horror, converting it into narrative. In doing so, it erased the boy, silenced his pain, and erected in his place a convenient monster. This practice persists. Real traumas are mapped onto entertainment. The humanity behind the legend erased. When we gaze upon Jean with present-day eyes, we see not just an historical oddity but a warning, an admonition that monsters are not born. They are made, and the line between victim and villain is often blurred. Jean was judged, confined, forgotten. Yet the echo of his nocturnal howls, real or imagined, still reverberates at the edges of our collective consciousness. Like an ancient mirror dusty with neglect, his story forces us to confront what we prefer to keep hidden. The specter of Jean Grenier haunts not only the judicial records of the 17th century, but the overlooked corners of popular culture, where horror and fascination intertwine. As time marches on, we see how his narrative has been reshaped, absorbed, diluted, and retold in myriad forms, as entertainment, symbol, or cautionary tale. Yet behind a teenage werewolf's myth lies a deeper current inviting us to revisit the roots of human fear and the ways we choose to face it. After his death, Jean's memory sank into oblivion until the 19th century, when Europe's renewed interest in medieval lore and the mysteries of the unconscious led psychiatrists, theologians, and Gothic authors to unearth his case. Among them was Sabine Baring-Gould, the esteemed Anglican priest and British folklorist who included Jean's story in his 1865 treatise, The Book of Werewolves, describing him as an authentic instance of lycanthropic belief transformed into mental disorder. Influenced by emerging ideas on pathology and deviance, Baring-Gould was among the first to suggest that Jean suffered from delusions born of abuse and isolation rather than being a servant of the devil as once believed. Yet this attempt at demystification did little to prevent Jean's symbolic resurrection in popular imagination. Early 20th century horror cinema sought liminal figures, beings both human and bestial, whose inner conflicts manifested in grotesque metamorphoses. It was in this milieu that the werewolf archetype gained strength, most notably in Universal Pictures' The Wolfman, 1941. Though uncredited, Jean Grenier stands as the obscure ancestor of Larry Talbot, the tragic character who becomes a beast under the full moon. The French adolescent who fancied himself a predator in the dark groves of La Roche-Chalais became a universal emblem of humanity's polarized nature, civilization at war with savagery. Modern reinterpretations of lycanthropy as a metaphor for adolescent angst, sexual awakening, marginalization, and mental anguish find their origin in Jean's case. Even as a child, Jean exhibited signs of profound psychic conflict, a fissure between his real self and the self he longed to be. He rejected his humanity not out of malice, but because no one had ever welcomed it. By imagining himself a wolf, he embraced an identity conferring strength, control, and freedom, everything life had denied him. Today, through the lenses of neuroscience and social psychology, we can identify clear symptoms of dissociation, post-traumatic stress, psychotic behavior, and feral syndrome, a rare phenomenon in which a child devoid of social interaction and affection adopts animalistic conduct. Such disorders, if ignored, not only warp one's sense of reality, but shape an entire existence around delusion. Jean may well be the most tragic exemplar of untreated pathology, suffocated by religious repression and institutional violence. Yet the question that persists and unsettles is, why do we choose to turn him into a monster? What is it in our collective psyche that demands suffering be transfigured into threat? Across centuries, countless historical figures showing deviant behavior have been cast as supernatural creatures, vampires, witches, specters, all projections of fears we lacked words for. Jean, the feral child, embodied the ancestral dread of the uncontrollable. Untamed childhood, unfettered instinct, regression to animal. This disquiet endures, reaching us today with renewed force. In an age when childhood mental disorders remain overlooked or misunderstood, Jean's story asserts itself as a grim allegory. The question that echoed through the convent corridors, is he a beast or a lost soul, still resonates in contemporary debates on criminal responsibility, rehabilitation, and the nature of evil. And here the horror acquires another dimension, not of blood and monstrous transformation, but of the neglect that turns pain into aberration. Jean Grenier was not born a wolf. He became one in the eyes of the world because no one offered him the right to be human. His story compels us to confront how we marginalize the vulnerable, preferring to brand them monsters rather than admit our failure to protect them. If those howls, if they ever occurred, were cries for recognition, they were not the roars of a predator, but the desperation of the unheard. In the end, Jean was more victim than perpetrator. Yet unlike silent victims, he howled, and that howl sealed his fate as a profane creature, forever enshrined in Europe's collective unconscious. Jean Grenier's journey is a cracked mirror. In its fractures, we see the uncomfortable reflections of our own society. Fear of the other, medicalization of deviance, romanticization of tragedy, and an appetite for narratives that simplify complexity. His memory endures not as an isolated case, but as a brutal synthesis of all we choose to avert our eyes from, in others and in ourselves. Jean Grenier was not merely the werewolf of La Roche-Chalais. He was the tragic embodiment of an ancient fear, not of beasts prowling under the full moon, but of a society faced with the distorted reflection of its own cruelty. The horror his story evokes does not stem from fangs or paws, but from the abandonment that shapes the soul, from pain finding solace only in the darkest fantasy. The frail boy who claimed to devour children was himself a child devoured by abuse, by neglect, by a culture that preferred myth to confronting its own failings. The figure of the werewolf has spanned centuries as a potent symbol of our repressed instincts. Yet Jean reminds us that behind the myth there is often flesh and bone, trauma and silence. His story reveals how the monsters we fear most can be products of collective neglect, and how, in our zeal for explanation, we opt for the fantastic over the human. So what lessons remain from this shadowed journey? Perhaps the most disquieting one. The truest horrors of history are not supernatural, but arise from what we do or fail to do for those who need care most. Jean Grenier was forgotten in life, yet his memory still pulses, like a distant howl, resonating in the furthest reaches of our conscience. If this story moved you, unsettled you, or provoked you, share it. Because the more we speak of the ghosts of the past, the less room there is for them to repeat themselves in the present. Until our next descent into history's shadows.